ただいま秋山からもご説明差し上げました通り、今日のミアシャイマー先生の講演、攻撃的現実主義オフェンシブ・リアリズムという概念なんですけれども、これを少しいろいろな方面から理解するのにですね、今日は素晴らしいコメンテーターをお迎えいたしました、青山学院大学教授の土山実男先生に、今日はいろいろとなんていうんでしょう、私たちと取りましてギャップを埋めていただくようなところでご指導をお願いしています。最初にですね、5分ほど土山先生から宮山さんの講演を聞かせていただくにあたって、イントロダクトリーセッションといいますか、こんなふうにこれを聞いてみましょうよというような解説をいただきまして、それからミアシャイマーさんにお話しいただこうと思っております。それでは土山先生、壇上にお願いできますでしょうか。簡単に先生のご略歴ご紹介いたします。青山学院大学ご卒業後、ジョージ・ワシントン大学やメリーランド州立大学大学院で、ご研究されまして PhD をお持ちでいらっしゃる国際政治安全保障の専門家でいらっしゃいます。青山学院大学の、副学長などをお務めになられて、現在は平和安全研究所日米パートナーシッププログラムディレクターおよび国際安全保障学会の副会長でもいらっしゃいます。では先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
はじめまして、土山と申します。私5分ほど宮シャイマー先生の学者としての経歴と申しますか、今日話をせっかくお伺いするときに参考になるような話を私のできる範囲の中でやらせていただきます。これでいいですか。宮シャイマー先生のこの大国政治の悲劇ですけれども、この本が日本語訳がですね、奥山さんが翻訳されまして出ましたときに、私の関係しております国際安全保障学会の機関紙に書評を書きました。でその時に私は宮シャイマー先生のおっしゃることに全て賛成しているわけではありませんが、この本はぜひ日本で読まれるべきだというふうに書きました。と申しますのは、先ほども秋山理事長の話にもありましたように、パワーポリティクスというような言葉を使うことに対して日本で抵抗があります。そういう使うこともやることに対しても抵抗がありましてですね、例えばこの最近といっても10年ぐらい前になりますか、ミドルパワー論をお書きになった先生の本の中にですね、なぜミドルパワー外交が必要か、すなわち日本は権力政治を降りたからなんだというような書き方がありますけれども、私はそれを見てですね、パワーポリティクスなり何なりそういうふうな政治のアプローチというのは自分で降りたり乗ったりできるものじゃないんで、例えば皆さんここに結婚されていてお子さんがおられる方いるかもしれませんが、小学生の娘に俺は明日からパパ辞めるよって言ったら子供は困ると思うんですね。で子供は子供なりに、日本には泣くこと自党には勝てない、自党ってどうやって英語で言うのか知りませんが、そういうことわざがありますけれども、子供は子供なりにパパに権力を行使しますし、奥さんはもっときついですし、なかなかそういうものが実情ですから、私は青山学院で教えておりますけど、キリスト教の学校ですけれども、やっぱりパワーポリティクスがあるわけですね。ですからましてや国家関係において親ということでありますので、私はこの安全保障とか国際政治を教えておりますけれども、必ず宮島先生のこの大国政治の第1章と2章、あるいは彼のストラクチャルインターナショナル・リレーションズでしたかな、そういう論文がありますけれども、それを必ず読ませましてですね、でそこから批判的に授業に入るということをやっております。で、その宮島先生、今度日本にお見えになったのが初めてなんだそうなんで、ぜひこれが最後にならないように我々でまたいろいろ努力しなきゃいけないと思いますけれども、先生はウエストポイントのご出身で博士号をコーネル大学で取られました。でその後コンベンショナルディタランスであるとかリデルハートですね、イギリスの戦略家のリデルハートについて書いた批判的にハートを批判したものですけどものがございます。しかし宮島先生を最も世界的に有名にしたのはバック・トゥ・ザ・フューチャーです。これはタイトルも良かったんですけど、映画のタイトルを取りまして、1990年にインターナショナル・セキュリティという雑誌に出まして、当時冷戦が終わるあるいは終わったという楽観論が書にあった中で、いや必ずしも冷戦が終わるということは安定的な国際政治にならないかもしれませんよというような論を展開されまして、冷戦体制っていうのは、いろいろなポイントがありますけれども、二極であった、あるいは米ソ間の力が対等であった、ヨーロッパの戦線セントラルフロントがあった、核の パシフィケーション効果といいますか、核の存在があった、等々がありまして安定してたんだと。でそれがなくなるわけですから、なくなって新しい力が台頭してくるかもしれない。例えばドイツが台頭すれば場合によっては核を持つかもしれないというような議論がありましてですね、もちろんその議論に対しては批判もありましたですけれども、そのバック・トゥ・ザ・フューチャーという議論がミアシャイマー先生の今日のお話に続くですね、原点になっているように私は思うんです。で私は音楽で教えておりますけれども、私の安全保障の前任者は坂中さんといいまして、坂中智久先生で朝日新聞から来られましたが、このバック・トゥ・ザ・フューチャーをすぐ翻訳されました。そしてアメリカ大使館が今はもう出しているかどうか、トレンドという雑誌出してましたが、あそこに翻訳を載せたことがございますが、そういうこのバック・トゥ・ザ・フューチャーに始まる議論をやや理論的に一般の方に読めるように解説されたのがこの大国政治の悲劇です。ということで、この大国政治の悲劇はですね、国際政治は基本的にパワーであると、国際政治の通貨はパワーであるというふうなことはその本の中にも書いてありますが、国家間の間には、国家の間には信頼の入り込む余地がないというような言い方をされていて、これもきつい言い方ですけれども、ミアシャイマー先生の鋭い見方であります。あるいは国家はサバイバルのためにはパワーの最大化を図る、大国は覇権国になろうとする、国家関係はセキュリティディレンマから逃れられない、セキュリティディレンマというのは A という国の安全保障が強められたときに B という国がそれを不安に思ったら B も強めますので、結果的に A も B も安全が弱くなるかもしれないというジレンマがあるということですね。でそういう見方に対して、先生は、ペシミズムと申しますか、批判的なところがございます。それでそういうようなことが例えば第一次世界大戦を引き起こした原因ではなかったかというような議論をされているわけで、そうであるならば21世紀の今の東アジアにおいて米中は日中はどうなりますかというような話を今日されるのではないかと思っております。それから先生はこのオフェンシブリアリズム、日本語でいうと攻撃的というんでなんとなく仰々しい感じがしますが、もともとはオフェンシブリアリズムとディフェンシブリアリズムと2つの考え方がありまして、ディフェンシブリアリズムの方は、これは宮島先生批判的にいつも書かれておられますけど、先ほどのセキュリティディレンマをどう逃れるかということをいろいろ議論している学派です。で私はどちらかというとディフェンシブリアリズムの方に関心がありますけれども、そういうこのディフェンシブリアリズムに立ちますと、1914年6月から7月のドイツとロシアの関係、あるいはその14年のドイツとロシアの関係ですね、これはセキュリティディレンマの典型みたいに見えるわけで、そういうことが原因で一次大戦が起こったんだったら、今どうなるかということを彼らはディフェンシブリアリズムはディフェンシブリアリズムの立場から今年は100周年にあたりますので、そういう議論をされているということです。それから宮島先生の議論は、リアリズム、オフェンシブリアリズムに基づく議論ですけれども、アメリカ外交に対して大体批判的です。批判的でありまして、例えばイラクのこの間の戦争ですけれども、イラク戦争が始まる前にですね、この戦争は戦略がないと、はっきりと説得力ある戦略を持っていないと、成功しても問題を問われるだろう、失敗したらもっと問われるだろうという結論になっているんですね。でその通りになったわけですけれども、そのイラクの問題をこのタイトル、そのウォルトと、今ハーバードにおられるウォルト先生と2人で書かれたアンネセサリー・ウォーって言うんですけど、不必要な戦争ということですね。そういうような論文がありますし、ではなぜイスラエル、なぜそのイラク戦争があったのかということについてはですね、これは大きい本がございまして、イスラエルロビーとアメリカの外交政策という本がありまして、結局イスラエルだと、イスラエルとネオコンが組んだのじゃないかというのが先生のご指摘です。でもちろんこれに対してもいろんな批判がありますけど、そういう本がある。それからそういう外交を展開したときにですね、息子のブッシュ大統領は核兵器があるから入るんだと、こう言いましたけども、核兵器なかったわけですね。どっかで核兵器がないということを知ったわけですから、そうなると嘘があるんじゃないかという議論がありまして、なぜリーダーは嘘をつくのかという本を書かれたりしております。そういう形で宮島先生は一方において国際政治のリアリズム理論、他方において米外交、アメリカ外交をずっと見ておられるわけです。で今アメリカにおけるリアリズム、リアリストの頂点に立っておられるのが宮島先生でありますので、今日の中国あるいはウクライナの話等々ですね、 我々いろいろ学ぶところが多いのじゃないかと思いますので、ぜひとも40分スピーチをされるそうですから、その後ディスカッションの場を設けますので、皆さんいろいろお考えください。ということで、私のあんまり参考になりませんが、どうもありがとうございました。
頭の準備がそろそろ整ってまいりましたですね。それではミアシャイマー先生をお迎えして講演に入りたいと思います。Dr. Mearsheimer, please go to the podium. Thank you. ミアシャイマー先生のご略歴はお手元の資料にございますし、今の土山先生のお話でもございましたので、もう大丈夫かなと思っております。ご準備ができましたら始めていただきましょう。
Can people hear me clearly in the back? Yes. You can? Okay. If I trail off, if I move away from the microphone, just wave your hand, and I'll make the necessary adjustment. Thank you for the kind words about me and my work, and thank you very much to the Tokyo Foundation for inviting me to come here today to speak. And I especially thank all of you for coming out today to hear what I have to say. I always find it a very humbling experience to recognize that so many people are interested in what I have to say. Now, as you know, the subject that I'm going to talk about today is basically what my realist theory of international politics has to say about the rise of China on one hand, and number two, about the Ukrainian crisis on the other hand. One might think at first glance that these two situations have little to do with each other, but I do not believe that is the case. And therefore, what I would like to do is proceed in the following way. First, I would like to give you my thinking about the consequences of the rise of China. Then second, I would like to describe to you what I think the causes and consequences are of the Ukraine crisis. And then three, I would like to link them together and explain to you why I think the Ukraine crisis is bad news for Japan and bad news for the United States as well. So that's how I'm going to proceed. Let me start by talking about the rise of China. As most of you know, I assume, my view is that China cannot rise peacefully. Now, it is important to emphasize here that I am simply assuming that China is going to continue to grow in an impressive way over the next 30 years, the way it has grown over the past 30 years. I'm not saying that that's going to happen. I'm assuming that it's going to happen. And as will become clear here as we move along, I hope that China does not continue to grow economically in an impressive way. But again, I'm going to assume that. And my argument is that if it does continue to grow, the consequences for the region will not be good. There will be an intense security competition between China on one hand and the United States and its Asian allies on the other hand. And among those Asian allies will be Japan. And not only will there be an intense security competition, there will be a real danger of a major war here in East Asia. Now, why do I say that? My basic view of international politics is that the ideal situation for any country is to dominate its region of the world and to make sure that no other country dominates its region of the world. Now, the reason that you want to dominate your region of the world is because that is the best way to survive in an international system like the one that we have. If you think about the international system that Japan and China and the United States operates in, it quickly becomes very clear that the distinguishing characteristic of that system is that states are the principal actors and that there's no higher authority that sits above those states. In the language of international relations theory, we say the system is anarchic. It's anarchy. It's anarchy in the sense that it's the opposite of hierarchy. There's no higher authority that sits above states. In other words, if a state gets into trouble in the international system, there's no night watchman, no policeman that it can turn to for help. Furthermore, one of the principal problems that states face in this system is that they can never know the intentions of other states. If I said to you, what will be the intentions of China in the year 2020? Or what will be the intentions of China in the year 2030? You could not tell me because you do not know who will be running China in those years. You do not even know who will be running Japan in the year 2020 or in the year 2030. Therefore, you have no idea what the intentions of China or Japan or the United States or Germany or Russia or any other country will be in the future. Intentions are uncertain. That means that all states operate in a system where there's no night watchman and where they cannot be certain of the intentions of other states. Well, the problem that you run into is what happens if you run into a really powerful state that has bad intentions towards you and there's no higher authority that you can turn to for help. You are in deep trouble. Therefore, states tend to fear each other. They tend to worry that a powerful state might sometime come after them and they'll have no recourse because there's no higher authority, no police that they can call. Now, when you operate in a system like that, you very quickly figure out that the best way to survive is to be the most powerful state in the system by far. Because if you're the most powerful state in the system, nobody else fools around with you. Nobody else thinks about attacking you. As I say to my fellow Americans when I give this talk, how many of you go to bed at night worrying about Canada or Mexico or Guatemala attacking the United States? The answer is nobody worries about that. And the reason they don't worry about it is because the United States is so powerful. You want to be much more powerful than all of your neighbors, because that is the best way to survive in the international system. Let's just talk a little bit about the United States. The United States, when it was created in 1783, was comprised of 13 states strung out along the Atlantic seaboard. Over the next roughly 70 years, the United States marched across North America, murdered huge numbers of Native Americans, stole their land, went to war against Mexico, and took what is today the southwest of the United States, invaded Canada in 1812 for the purpose of making Canada a part of the United States, and furthermore had a deep-seated interest in making the countries in the Caribbean, Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, part of the United States. The only reason those countries are today not part of the United States is because of the slavery issue. What I'm telling you is that the United States worked very hard to create this powerful state that now dominates North America. We did something else to achieve that end. It's called the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, President James Monroe told the European great powers that at the time had empires in North and South America, that we are now not powerful enough to throw you out of the Western Hemisphere, but we will eventually throw you out and you will not be welcome back. This is the Monroe Doctrine. By 1900, in the wake of the Spanish-American War, the United States was a regional hegemon. It was the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. We worked very hard to achieve that end, and we did it because the best way to survive in the international system is to make sure you are a regional hegemon. We had a second goal. The second goal was to make sure that we never had a peer competitor. We never faced another country in another region of the world that was a hegemon like us in the Western Hemisphere. In the 20th century, there were four countries that threatened to either dominate Asia or Europe. Those four countries were Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The United States, as you all know, played a key role in putting all four of those countries on the scrap heap of history. The United States does not tolerate peer competitors. The United States wants to live in a world where it is the only country that dominates its region of the world. The name of the game in international politics is, number one, to be a regional hegemon, and number two, make sure that there is no other regional hegemon on the planet. And the United States has followed those two precepts throughout its history. This brings us to the question of how you think China is likely to behave. China is going to imitate the United States if it can, which, by the way, Japan tried to do in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s. Japan, when it was really powerful, when it was the most powerful state in Asia, tried to dominate this region, much the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. As China grows more powerful, it will do two things. Number one, it will go to great lengths to make sure it is much more powerful than Japan. It will go to great lengths to make sure it's much more powerful than India and Russia. It will want to make sure that there's no power located in this region that can threaten it. If you talk to the Chinese about the balance of power, they will tell you very clearly that when they were weak between 1850 and 1950, they suffered what is called, in their lexicon, the century of national humiliation. They never intend to return to that period. And they fully understand that the best way to avoid it is to be by far the most powerful state in Asia, so that no country, Japan included, can threaten them. Furthermore, like the United States with its Monroe Doctrine, they have a deep-seated interest in pushing us out of Asia, much the way we pushed the great European empires out of the Western Hemisphere. If you talk to the Chinese behind closed doors, they will talk about pushing the Americans out beyond the first island chain and eventually pushing the Americans out beyond the second island chain. I do not blame them one bit. If I were running national security in Beijing, I would behave exactly the same way. As an American, I like the Monroe Doctrine. As an American, I like the fact that we dominate the Western Hemisphere. Is this because I'm naturally an aggressive person and I think America should be an aggressive person? Absolutely not. It's because I understand that the best way to survive in the international system is to be a regional hegemon. The Chinese, who think very much like me, understand that fully. And they will go to great lengths as they continue to grow economically to translate that economic might into military might and to dominate Asia. And again, I do not blame them at all. I would do exactly the same thing if I were in their shoes. This brings us to the question of what you think the United States will do and what you think China's neighbors will do. It's very clear what the United States will do. The United States will balance against China. This is what the pivot to Asia is all about. The United States, as I said to you, does not tolerate peer competitors. The historical record is very clear on this point. We do not want to see a situation where China dominates Asia, because our great fear is that if China dominates Asia, it will then be free to roam into the Western Hemisphere, where we don't want them to come. We want China to face other great powers in Asia and to, in effect, be pinned down in Asia so they're not free to roam into the Western Hemisphere. So we will go to great lengths to prevent China from dominating Asia. Of course, the Indians, the Japanese, the Russians, the Vietnamese, the Singaporeans, the South Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Malaysians, the Indonesians, all have similar incentives. You do not have an interest in seeing China dominate Asia. You have an interest in working with the United States to try to contain China. So what will happen here, in my opinion, is that as China continues to rise, it will try to dominate Asia, and the United States and Japan and Russia and other countries in the region, in all likelihood, will come together and form a balancing coalition designed to contain China. And this will produce an intense security competition, and that intense security competition will be very dangerous, and there will be a serious possibility of war between China and its neighbors and between China and the United States. It's for this reason that I said earlier on that I hope that China does not continue to grow economically and that its economic performance levels off. That's the first part of my talk. Let me now switch gears, talk about the Ukraine crisis, and then in the third part of my talk, as I said, I'll try and tie the two parts of the talk together. As you know, since February of this year, actually since February 22nd of 2014, we have been faced with a major crisis over Ukraine. And it basically involves the United States and its West European allies against Russia. Now, the $64,000 question, as we say in the United States, is what caused this crisis? In the United States, and to a lesser extent in Western Europe, the conventional wisdom is that the crisis was caused by Vladimir Putin, or more generally by the Russians. And what we have here is a situation where Putin would like to recreate the Soviet Union, or to put it in slightly different terms, he would like to create a greater Russia. The argument is that Putin has expansionist tendencies, and we have to go to great lengths to contain him. And if you look at what's happened since February 22nd, there's no doubt that's the case. This is the conventional wisdom. I believe this conventional wisdom is wrong. I believe that the crisis over Ukraine was created by the West, mainly by the United States, but the West Europeans or the European Union played a key role in fostering this crisis. Now, why exactly do I say that? It's very important to understand that starting in the mid-1990s, the United States and its European allies began to push NATO eastward. They began to think about pushing the EU eastward. They began to think about promoting democracy in the former Soviet Union. And the ultimate goal was to take the states of Eastern Europe and some of the states of the former Soviet Union, this includes Ukraine and Georgia, and make them Western bulwarks on Russia's border. In other words, make them part of the West. In the case of Ukraine, the key decision point was the April 2008 NATO summit at Bucharest. When that summit ended, April 2008, NATO said that both Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. The Russians, who had opposed NATO expansion since the mid-1990s, made it perfectly clear at the time that this was unacceptable to them. The idea that Ukraine or Georgia was going to be turned into a Western bulwark on their border was not in the cards. Putin made that clear. Medvedev made that clear. The Russian foreign minister made that clear. That was not going to happen, they said. And it is no accident that in August 2008, there was a war between Russia and Georgia that was precipitated by this very issue. The Georgians thought that they were going to become part of the West, that the West would protect them, that they could provoke the Russians and get away with it. They found out differently. The Russians made it clear that was not going to happen. Nevertheless, NATO, the EU, and the West in general continued to encroach on Russia's borders. And what happened was, in February of this year, the United States played a key role in helping to facilitate a coup in Ukraine that toppled the leader who was seen by the Russians as, generally speaking, pro-Russian, and who was replaced by a leader who was seen as deeply hostile to Russia. The Russians interpreted this as evidence, right, that the United States and its European allies were still in the business of trying to make Ukraine a Western bulwark. The response of Vladimir Putin was twofold. First, he took Crimea, which has great strategic and economic importance, not to mention historical importance to Russia. And furthermore, he set out to destroy Ukraine. There's much talk in the West about how Putin and the Russians are interested in conquering Ukraine. This is not true. What Putin is doing is he's telling the West and he's telling the Ukrainians, in effect, that as long as you persist in trying to make Ukraine a Western bulwark, I will go to great lengths to destroy it and prevent that from happening. And that's exactly what's happening here. Putin is wrecking Ukraine. Of course, we're playing right into his hands, as are the Ukrainians. But he's not interested in conquering the country. He's not going to let it become a Western bulwark. Now, a lot of people say that it's hard to understand why Putin feels this way. Doesn't he understand that this is the 21st century? I find this argument almost incomprehensible. Great powers are very sensitive about their security. The idea that NATO can march up to Russia's doorstep and the Russians are going to say, it doesn't matter, and you can do whatever you want with NATO, is simply unthinkable to me. We have a Monroe Doctrine. If China gets really powerful and Canada and Mexico decide to form an alliance with China, and they invite the Chinese into Canada and Mexico, do you think the United States is going to say, this is no big deal? That would never happen. The Canadians and the Mexicans know full well that there is absolutely no way they could ever form a military alliance with China and allow China to come into the Western Hemisphere. It is unthinkable that the United States would allow that. Well, why does anyone think that the Russians are going to tolerate NATO, a military alliance that was an adversary for over 40 years, to march up to their doorstep? And you remember the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, where we tried to facilitate democracy and put into power democratic leaders, which is just another way of saying putting into power leaders who are pro-Western? You don't think this is going to bother the Russians? You don't think when Western leaders begin to talk or hint about toppling Putin and replacing him with a democratically elected leader, that this is really going to raise Putin's hackles and make him paranoid? This is geopolitics 101. But in the West, especially in the United States, we've abandoned thinking along the lines of geopolitics 101. We think you can just do pretty much anything you want and get away with it. Well, you can't. And Putin has made that very clear to us. But the United States and its European allies still haven't learned the lesson. What are we doing in response to what's going on? Instead of backing off, we're doubling down. We put economic sanctions on them, on the Russians, significant economic sanctions. We're talking about stationing troops in Eastern Europe that heretofore we've not had there. The U.S. Congress would actually like to arm the Ukrainians. You think the Russians are just going to stand there and let this happen? This is not my understanding of how great powers act. Great powers are very sensitive about their security. And when they think they're in real trouble, they tend to lash out. And this is a country with nuclear weapons. You do not want to put Russians in a situation where they feel like they're in desperate straits. You better be very careful pushing them around. But the United States doesn't think that way anymore, and it basically takes the Europeans along with them. So we're continuing to double down. And people are enthusiastic about the fact the Russians are suffering. And they're saying, well, I bet the Russians will throw up their hands and we'll live happily ever after. I would not bet much money on that. This one could get really ugly. Now, many Europeans think this is a good thing because they think that means that the Americans will stay in Europe, right? That NATO will be refurbished. It'll have a second life, maybe. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But in my opinion, this whole situation is having very negative consequences. First of all, you now have a situation where Russia on one hand and the West on the other hand have terrible relations. Up until February of this year, the Russians and the Americans and the Russians and the Europeans actually had reasonably good relations. They were not great, but they were reasonably good. Those relations have significantly deteriorated. And why is this bad for the West? First of all, we need the Russians on Syria. They've been very helpful on Syria. As many of you know, it was the Russians who pulled Barack Obama's chestnuts out of the fire in August 2013 on the Syria crisis involving chemical weapons. We need the Russians on Iran. We need the Russians on loose nuclear weapons or loose nuclear materials. We need the Russians on exiting Afghanistan. Russians are important players to us. We need their cooperation. It's going to be increasingly difficult to get them to cooperate with us. This is a terrible situation, right? So what do you have here now? What you have is a situation where in Asia you have a rising China that is sure to become, in my opinion, an adversary of the United States and of Japan. And in Europe, you have a Russia that heretofore had quite friendly relations with the United States that has also basically become an adversary. In the early post-Cold War period, the United States was by far the most powerful state on the planet, and it had good relations with both Russia and China was nowhere near as powerful then as it is now. What's happened over time is that China is rising, and if it continues to rise, it will eventually be even more powerful than the United States. China is rising, and China and the United States have very testy relations, which are likely to get much worse, and the United States and Russia have bad relations. This is why people are now talking about a multipolar world. This brings me to the third part of my talk, which is what is the linkage between these two situations, the rise of China on one hand and Ukraine on the other. Actually, what has happened regarding Ukraine is bad for security in Asia from a Japanese and from an American point of view. It's excellent news from China's perspective. Now, why do I say that? First of all, what's happened here as a result of the Ukraine crisis is that the Russians have been driven into the arms of the Chinese. And as I said to you before, as China continues to rise, it's going to be necessary to put a balancing coalition together to contain China. And that balancing coalition needs to include the Russians. The Japanese and the Russians, the Americans and the Russians all have a deep-seated interest in working together to contain China. And by the way, if you go to Moscow and talk to people, there's a deep-seated fear of China there. So in a very important way, they are natural allies of Japan and the United States for the purpose of containing China. But what have we done, and here I'm talking about the United States and its West European allies, we have driven the Chinese into the arms of the Russians. From a geopolitical point of view, this is foolishness. The second thing is the United States, as you know, has been talking about pivoting to Asia. The United States understands that of all the possible threats that it faces in the future, there is no threat on the planet that comes close to being as worrisome as the China threat. So what the United States is talking about doing is pivoting to Asia. As many of you know, historically, Europe has been the most important area of the world for the United States, outside of the Western Hemisphere. The second most important area of the world was Asia, and the third most important area was the Persian Gulf. Those are the three areas outside the Western Hemisphere that the United States privileges from a security point of view. And Europe, as I said, has always been the most important area of the world for us. That is changing in fundamental ways. And Asia is now becoming the most important area of the world. I believe the Persian Gulf will become the second most important area of the world, and Europe will be a distant third. So when we talk about pivoting to Asia, that means we're pivoting away from some area. And the area that we were intending to pivot away from was Europe. But now, given the crisis over Ukraine and the need to strengthen NATO, the United States is going to find it increasingly difficult to pivot to Asia because it's pinned down in Europe as a result of the Ukraine crisis in ways that it was not before February 22nd. Before February 22nd, if you went to Europe and you talked to the European elites, they were fearful that the United States was abandoning Europe for Asia. And there was an element of truth in that argument, because Europe was going from our number one strategic priority outside the Western Hemisphere to number three. But now we have this situation where all of a sudden NATO is of great importance because of Ukraine. A foolish crisis. In addition, the United States has decided to launch another war in the Middle East. It's like we can't get enough wars in the Middle East to satisfy us. This is the 7th war. You realize this is the 7th war that the United States has fought since 1989? We have been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since 1989. We have fought 7 separate wars, and this war against ISIS is number 7. So at a time when the United States is talking about pivoting to Asia, it created a crisis with Russia over Ukraine. It was remarkably foolish, and it foolishly declared war against ISIS. And both of these conflicts are going to make it difficult to pivot to Asia, which makes no sense. So when you start thinking about Asian security, right, what you see is, number one, instead of having the Russians with us for the foreseeable future, the Russians have been pushed into the arms of the Chinese. Not good. And number two, it's hard to see how you can have a meaningful American pivot to Asia. And this has very significant consequences for Japan. It has very significant consequences for Japan for 2 reasons. The first reason is that if you look around East Asia, there are not a lot of other big powers that you can depend on. The Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, Taiwan. I mean, who are you going to depend on? You need Uncle Sam. You fully understand that. And Uncle Sam, to begin with, looked like he understood the basic logic and would pivot out here and help you out. But instead, Uncle Sam is now mired down in another war in the Middle East, and it looks like he's going to stay in Europe in a meaningful way. There's another reason that this matters for you, and that is that you don't have nuclear weapons. And as China continues to rise and the security competition begins to heat up, you're going to have a situation out here where every major player except Japan has nuclear weapons. China has nuclear weapons, Russia has nuclear weapons, India has nuclear weapons, and the United States has nuclear weapons. You don't. And the truth is, nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrent, and states that live in dangerous neighborhoods like to have their own nuclear weapons, not because they're crazy, but because they're smart. Right? You don't have nuclear weapons, and if you get into a crisis with China and you don't have nuclear weapons, you're going to be very nervous. You, of course, know that, and you have a solution, or at least you've had a solution up to now, and that is you depend on the American nuclear umbrella. The American nuclear umbrella is over your head. You're relying on Uncle Sam, not just for security. You're relying on Uncle Sam for nuclear deterrence. You're relying on Uncle Sam to be there for you and to be smart. But if you look at what's happening, it's not clear that Uncle Sam will be there in a meaningful way, and it's not clear that Uncle Sam will be smart. If you look at what's happened in Ukraine, Uncle Sam did not behave smartly, and furthermore, Uncle Sam has now put himself in a position where it's going to be difficult to pivot to Asia and to be there for you in a meaningful way. So the Ukraine crisis has significant implications for Japan. And those implications are not good. Let me conclude by saying that there is one cause for optimism, and that is that it is early in the game. China is rising, but China is not a behemoth at this point in time. That's about 10, 15 years down the road. And one hopes that as that China threat becomes more manifest, or as that China threat manifests itself and becomes clearer, that the United States wakes up and understands that it's important to pivot to Asia and to work closely with Japan to provide it with a security umbrella and the nuclear umbrella, and to contain China. Thank you.
宮シャイマー先生、どうもありがとうございました。それでは、宮シャイマー先生、お机の方に移って、Could you move to the desk and take your seat? And、土山先生も、ご登壇いただきまして、今日の今のお話を、どのように聞くべきか、解説をいただきたいと思います。それでは、ご準備できましたら、15分ほど土山先生による、コメントを頂戴したいと思います。よろしくお願いいたします。
私から15分ということですけれども、もうこれ5時までに終わる予定ですので、皆さんからいろいろクエスチョンがあると思いますが、私の方はなるべく短くやらせていただきます。今私初めのところでですね、宮シャイマー先生のこの論文なり本なりを大学の授業で使いますということを申し上げましたが、なぜ使うかと言いますと、先生の英語は非常にクリアで明晰なんですね。読みやすいんです。今日の講演もそうで、私もあんまり通訳なくても私の英語力でも大体わかりますね。ですから非常に説得力があります。説得力がある分ですね、私としてはコメントがしにくい。批判はしにくいですな。それで私の思っている感じましたことをいくつか申しますと、まず中国とウクライナの問題ですけれども、中国をどう見るかと、台頭する中国をどんなふうに我々は考えたらよいのかということですね。で、先生は大国はすべて覇権になろうとしているんだと、こういうことを何度も言われておりますので、さて中国は覇権になるのかどうかですね、どういう覇権になるのか、アメリカをレプレイスするような覇権になるのか、違う言い方をすれば、中国はチャレンジャー、あるいは現状変革アクターになるのか、あるいはステータスコアパワーとして残るのかということですね。で、リベラルの論者はですね、例えば日本によくお見えになるアイケンベリー先生などはですね、中国は今のアメリカの秩序の中に入るだけであって、そこの秩序の中で自分のパワーを大きくしようとしてるんだと、アメリカの脅威にはならないんじゃないかというような言い方をリベラルはされます。に対して、宮シャイマー先生は少し見方が違うわけで、もっと警戒心を持っておられると思うんですね。それで、このパワーバランスが変わるときに国際政治は常に戦争になるのかどうか、どれくらいトラブルかということです。で、力が変わるとき、例えばその1914年もその前後もそうですが、力が変わるときに、パワーバランスが変わるときに、いつも戦争になったわけでは必ずしもないわけですね。アメリカがイギリスを抜きますけど、あるいはロシアも他の国々を抜きますけれども、その時に必ずしも戦争になっているわけではありませんし、一次大戦も仮にドイツが力を強化したからといって、ドイツとイギリスの間で戦争が始まったわけではないわけですね。という見方をすると、今の中国が大きくなるのにつれて、中国がどういう理由で戦争になるとすればするのかということが私は知りたいわけですね。米中戦争は不可避的なのか避けられるのかということを私は知りたい。それからその中国の今アサーティブネスということを言いますが、中国がいろいろ力の拡大をしております。で、その中国のアサーティブネスがどれくらいその今のパワーバランスの中国のパワーの強化、大きくなっていることと関連しているのか、その他にもいろんな理由があるのかどうかですね。中国が自分が大きくなったんで、大きくなった分はより主張ができるんだと思っているのかどうかですね。で、そういう目で見ますと、中国がどんなふう、中国をこれから東アジアなり国際政治の中でどういうふうに位置づけていくのかと、もう両方の力がバランスしてそこで決めるしかないのか、何か違う決め方があるのかですね。それで、この先ほど私の初めのイントロの中で、今年がたまたま一次大戦の100周年ということもありまして、 リアリズムの議論の中にもこの一次大戦を今の問題にひっつけて議論する議論がたくさんございます。10年ほど前になりますけど、ブレゼンスキーさんがですね、カーター政権の安全保障担当補佐官をしたブレゼンスキーがザ・チョイスという本の中で、今の中国はだんだん1914年のドイツに似てきたと書いておられるんですね。ですから中国が力をつけるに伴って中国が危ないと、こんなふうに見て将来のこの東アジアでの紛争なり戦争なりを考えるべきなのか、あるいはミアシャイマー先生がやや批判的に認められる、ディフェンシブリアリストのグループが一次大戦は、状況の認識に誤りがあって、例えば先ほど申しましたようにドイツのカイザーが、あるいは首相がですね、首相が14年の6月28日に例の暗殺がありますと、7月の5日にはもうオーストリーはドイツに特使を送ってまいりまして、セルビアを叩く場合にはドイツの支援が不可欠だというんで送ってくるわけですが、その時のドイツの認識は間違っていたわけですね。でドイツだけではなくて、ロシアの認識も間違っておりましたし、イギリスもその時点ではそんな深刻に考えていなかったわけで、オーストリーが最後通知を出した23日ぐらいからグレー外務大臣は、イギリスのグレー外務大臣は動き出すわけですけれども、各国がそれぞれに状況の展開を間違った、そのことがああいうそのトラジェディを生んだというふうな見方がもしあるとすれば、今の東アジアでそういうことがありえないかどうかということの方がむしろ心配じゃないかという2つの見方があります。中国が強くなることが問題だ、その中国が強くなった中で環境が変わって、いろんな問題を我々が今の尖閣の問題ですよ、いろいろな問題をどっかでハンドリングを間違った場合に、それが積もり積もって重なってトラジェディが起きるんじゃないかと、こういう議論がありますが、宮島先生の議論はもっぱらパワーに焦点を置かれておりますけど、そういう2つの見方があるんではないかと私は思います。それで日中に関して申しますと、日中に対して中国がああいう非常に強い、オフェンシブ外交と申しますか、展開をしておりますが、あのことが日本が例えば国有化を、尖閣諸島の国有化をしたことが一つの原因なのか、あるいは中国どっちが原因か、鶏が先か卵が先かみたいな議論になりますけど、中国がそれをどんなふうに捉えているかということが日中間では非常な問題になるだろうと思います。今の中国に対しても、あるいは日本についてもですね、先ほど先生のその本の中で国家関係に信頼という余地はないということが書かれているということを申しましたが、日中間の現時点における信頼関係というのは最低ですね。正常化以来最低です。中国人は日本を11%、日本が信頼できる国家であると見ているのが 11%、日本は 2.6% しかありません。ですので、別に日本の方にもっと信用しなさいと私言いませんけれども、ここまで追っているということには相当深刻な問題があるわけで、こういうことが長く続くことは決していいことではないわけで、そういうその問題を我々としてはどんなふうに考えるかと、もちろん日米同盟等々いろいろなものを使わなければならないわけですけれども、日本人としてはどう考えるか。それからもう一つの問題、ウクライナの問題です。ウクライナの問題につきましては、先生がフォーレンアフェアーズに書かれまして、これは大反響を読んでおります。で、先生のご議論はですね、基本的にウクライナのああいう問題は西側のハンドリングの問題があったんじゃないかということを指摘されているわけで、その西側の問題、NATO 側の問題というのは、NATO の東方拡大に始まるこのハンドリングの問題にあったというのが先生のご指摘です。で、この立場というのは亡くなった外交家のジョージ・ケナンがずっと一貫して言っておられたことで、東方拡大は冷戦後アメリカ外交の最大の失策になるんではないかということをずっと言っておられました。で、そのことがどれくらい正しいかどうかをともかくとして、今のウクライナ問題の基礎にあると私は思います。ですけれども、それだけかということですね。そこにいろいろな問題があるはずなので、例えばウクライナの問題ですね。ウクライナで、今の前の大統領の時にですね、EU の EU に加盟する EU のあれは政治貿易協定と言いましたが、その調印を前の大統領は拒否されましたので、去年の11月ですか、反政府デモが起きて、今の事態に拡大しているわけですけれども、ですからそういうウクライナの展開もありますし、それからプーチン大統領自身のやり方の問題といいますか、宮島先生はファーストレベルのこの戦略家とファーストクラスストラテジストというふうに書いておられましたが、プーチンもどっかで誤ってるんではないかと私は感じがしないでもありません。非常に彼のきついやり方ですね。彼が大統領になってああいう外交展開をしているわけで、NATO の東方拡大はずっとそれより昔から始まっているわけですから、今起こっている問題はやっぱりプーチンが大統領になってからの問題なわけですから、プーチンさんのやり方というのは、あまり安倍首相のことを言うつもりもありませんけど、この間の選挙がそうですね、野党が準備してないところを、九州、この先制攻撃をかけたようなのがこの間の選挙のような感じがしますが、ですから安倍さんはおそらくプーチンと最も気心が通じるんじゃないかと私は思いますけれども、プーチンの外交のやり方があります。そういうことでウクライナがこういうふうな問題になっている背景にはですね、宮島先生がおっしゃるようなパワーバランスの、あるいはそういう地政学的な問題があることは間違いない。しかしそれだけではないんじゃないかと。ですから地政学的に見る方は宮島先生みたいな見方をされる方が多いです。例えば先ほどのブリジンスキーですけど、最近新聞に書かれた、最近といってもこの春ですけど、ファイナンシャルタイムズに書かれたものでは、フィンランドのような形で、ウクライナを片付けられないかという言い方をされておりますし、キッシンジャーもですね、ワシントンポストかニューヨークタイムズに書かれたものの中で、そういうような意味のことを言っておられて、先生が、この宮島先生が言っておられる、このウクライナのバッファー的な役割ということを非常に言っておられるわけですね。ですから、彼らはそのネオリアリストとかオフェンシブリアリストとかいうわけではありませんが、地政学的なことを重要視するこの外交に担当された携わった方はそういうふうな見方をするところがありまして、たまたまブリゼンスキーはポーランド、キッシンジャーはドイツの出身ですけれども、ヨーロッパから見るとそういうことが言える面があるのかもしれませんのでですね、そういった問題をどんなふうに我々として考えるか、それで日本のことと関係するわけですけど、私の一つ質問を宮島先生にするとしたら、先ほど日米同盟のこととおっしゃられましたけれども、日本がこの戦後の外交の中でですね、大国外交を展開する必要はありませんが、日本の外交に具体的にどういう期待をされているかということを私はお伺いしたい。で、先ほどのブリゼンスキーですけど、昔々、もう30年ほど前にですね、日本外交を論じまして、彼は半年ぐらい日本にいまして、フラジャルブロッサム、ひ弱な花っていうタイトルで本を書かれました。で、日本にとっては非常にチクチクと皮肉たっぷりの本なんですけども、ミアシャイマー先生が今日本外交論をお書きになるとしたら、どんなふうに日本を書かれるか、そして何を日本に期待されるかということは、その質問をしたいと思います。で、あともう時間がありませんので、フロアに質問をいただいて先生にお答えをいただきたいと思います。ありがとうございました。
宮島さん、最初に土山先生がおっしゃった最後の質問、ちょっとお答えになりますか？フロアの質問を受け付ける前に。
I will do it very quickly so we can maximize the amount of time that people have to ask questions. Can people not hear? I think that did it. Okay, can everybody in the back hear me? Excellent, thank you. I apologize for that. Technology has never been my strong suit. I'm a theorist, as you know. With regard to the professor's question, my expectation is that Japan will be a more normal country in the future. Japan will not behave, if China continues to rise, in the future the way it has in the past. I believe Japan will end up spending a lot more money on defense. I believe that Japan will be much more worried about the possibility of a real war than it has been since 1945. It's worried some, but not greatly. I think if you look at the recent crises over the Senkaku Islands, that's a harbinger of things to come. I believe that Japan is going to think seriously about acquiring nuclear weapons in ways that it has not since 1945. This is not to say that Japan will not get nuclear weapons, that Japan will get nuclear weapons. I'm not arguing that. I'm just arguing you will think long and hard about it because you understand they are the ultimate deterrent. I also believe that it will not be Japanese domestic opinion that prevents Japan from getting nuclear weapons. It'll be American opposition because I believe the United States will not want you to have nuclear weapons. And I believe the public in Japan will be turned around over time on this issue. I may prove wrong. But I think that Japan is going to go back to being a normal power. Now, does this mean that Japan is going to go on a rampage and that this is going to be the 1930s all over again? Absolutely not, right? The rising power in the region is China, not Japan. In fact, because of demographics, Japan is a declining power. The major player in the balancing coalition against China is going to be the United States. And you're going to work closely with the United States as a normal country, but you are going to be basically playing second fiddle, and the Americans will be doing most of the heavy lifting simply because the United States is so much more powerful than Japan.
はい、ありがとうございました。それではですね、クエスチョンタイムにしたいと思います。なるべく多くの方の質問を聞きたいので、2ラウンドぐらいに分けまして、2、3まとめて、それから東京財団の研究員もこの機会に合わせて質問させていただきますので、それもご了承くださいませ。さあ、いかがでしょう。手を挙げていただけますか。はい。それでは、一番最初に挙げられました、こちらですね。から2番目、渡辺研究員お願いいたします。
すいません。今ですね、ロシアが中国の味方になって、で、日本は非常に大変なことになるというお話でしたが、日本とロシアっていうのは今、プーチン、先ほど言いましたように、プーチンと安倍さんが非常にいい関係にあるということなので、これは日本はロシアにどういうような交渉をし、どういうような方向へ持っていった方がいいのかですね、そこら辺ちょっとご教授願いたいと思います。よろしくお願いします。
ありがとうございました。じゃあ渡辺さん行きましょう。
Professor Mearsheimer, thank you very much. Very, very stimulating this talk and discussion. I'm Nabe Watanabe, Tokyo Foundation. I have a question about the recently. How do you think about China's intention? The talking about the President Xi Jinping talked about new types of major power relations. Of course, the contents are not so clear, but I tend to see some negative aspect of this. Respect each other's power and influence over, and do not want touch anything to your side. That's you mentioned the Monroe Doctrine between the U.S. and the European power. Do you think some such an element in the China's intention, a new type of the major power relations? Thank you.
はい、もう一方、3つまとめてにしたいと思いますが、はい、それじゃあ一番前の。
Ken Oda, Kitamura Building. Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. You mentioned about so much of problem about Russia, China, and so forth. But if you become a Secretary of State in next administration, what will be the first thing you will do?
はい、ありがとうございました。大変面白い質問が出ました。それでは、日露関係について、それから習近平の中国のありようについて、それからもし国務長官になられたらどうしますかという3つについてまずお答えいただけますでしょうか。
Okay, I'll answer the questions in the order that they came, and I'll turn to the first question, which had to do with relations between Prime Minister Abe and President Putin, I think it is clear that they are on quite good terms and that the Japanese Prime Minister would like to reach out to Putin. I think, not surprisingly, this is wonderful and that he should pursue this policy in the future. But even more important, what the Prime Minister should do, this is the Japanese Prime Minister, is he should pick up the telephone and he should call Barack Obama and he should give him a lecture on the importance of improving relations with Putin, of solving this crisis, getting this crisis behind us so that the United States can reduce its commitment to Europe and pivot to Asia and deal with the rise of China. With regard to the second question, Chinese intentions and all this talk of a new type of major power relations, this is just mindless talk that's designed to make people think that China can rise peacefully. Please don't believe this. The United States talks this way, right? The United States acts in ruthless ways and then covers up its ruthless behavior with liberal rhetoric. This is the way really sophisticated great powers operate. The Chinese are fully aware that everybody in Asia is nervous about their rise. They understand that people in Japan are scared. They understand that people in Vietnam and the Philippines and South Korea are scared. They understand the Americans are scared. They have a vested interest in doing everything they can to ameliorate that fear, to make you think that they can rise peacefully. It's a very smart strategy on their part, right? So they can talk like that, and it matters on the margins. But in the end, there's not going to be any new type of major power politics. Great powers all behave the same way. And I will tell you, I've said this a number of times since I've been in Japan. I've been to China a number of times. And there's no people on the planet who are more realist than the Chinese. And I sometimes start my talks in China by saying, it's good to be back among my people, because the Chinese are realists. So if there's any group of people on the planet who are going to behave according to the dictates of Realism 101 and try to dominate Asia, it's the Chinese. What would I do if I was Secretary of State? Well, first of all, you don't have to worry about me being Secretary of State. No, I will. Your question's an excellent question. I would, at this point in time, do two things. And the two things I would suggest are consistent with the talk that I just gave. First of all, I would end the war against ISIS, and I would buck pass. I would get the local powers in the region, the Turks, the Iranians, the other countries, to deal with ISIS. I do not think ISIS is a serious threat to core American interests. And I would stay out of the Middle East. It's important for the United States to end all these wars in the Middle East and stay out. And then the second thing I would do is I would fundamentally alter our policy towards Ukraine. That's of enormous importance. As the professor said, what I recommend we do is we turn Ukraine into a neutral buffer state. I'd end all talk of NATO expansion, EU expansion, and I'd go to great lengths to work with Putin to create a vibrant and neutral Ukraine. Those would be the two things I'd do right off the bat.
はい、ありがとうございました。それでは第2ラウンドいきたいと思います。今日せっかく土山先生もいらして、先ほどコメントもくださいましたので、お二方への質問も合わせたいと思います。じゃあ第2ラウンド、最初はすいません、東京財団の浅野からスタートしましょうか。で、その他、皆様ご質問いただきたいので、また挙げてくださいませ。お願いします。
東京財団の浅野と申します。高明さんの Research Fellow at Tokyo Foundation。 Today, I never felt happier that I'm a research fellow at Tokyo Foundation. I have the privilege to ask you this question. Thank you for your passionate talk. First, realist theory in Japan. For a very long time, Japan has been anomaly in terms of realist theory. That even our economy were growing, and when our national power was growing, Japan never seriously pursued to enhance our defense capabilities. And even during the Cold War, when there seemed like U.S. commitment in Asia seemed wavering, Japan never considered expanding our military power, let alone going nuclear, never aimed for becoming a regional hegemon. So now I'm sure you know that under the Abe administration, Japan has been rapidly developing our defense policies. Is this I told you so moment for a realist theorist like you? And also, geopolitics 101, you mentioned that the great powers have a sphere of influence, and that should be acknowledged. What would it have become of Japan if and when China starts declaring its own Monroe Doctrine? Are we a lost cause? Thank you.
はい、それでは他にも手を挙げてくださっていらっしゃいましたですね。はい、中ほどの茶色のジャケットの方、そして一番手前の方、そしてもう一方いらっしゃいましたですね。はい、その順番で行かせていただきます。
貴重なお話ありがとうございました。中国が覇権を目指すとして、それに日米プラスアルファの、多国間の体制を作って、やろうという考え方があるかと思いますが、アジアでそういう体制を作ることは可能だとお考えでしょうか。あとオフェンシブリアリズムの立場からそういうマルチラテラルの体制っていうのはどういうふうに位置づけられるでしょうか。機能するのかしないのか、よろしくお願いします。
はい、ありがとうございます。それでは一番前の、ジャケットの
先生にお伺いします。大国になっていくと覇権の方向に行くというふうに、本にも書かれておっしゃいましたけれども、大国になるのはこれは基本的に経済が強くならなければ大国にはなれない。その後軍事力となるわけですけれども、しかし今その経済力が強くなるというのは基本的に例えばアメリカにも大量に輸出して、あるいはアメリカからも資本投資もらって、経済力をつけているわけですね。中国がつけてで、そういうようなグローバルな関係にあるわけですから、これ発見していくとそこの関係っていうのが非常に経済的な問題、逆にまた経済の規模がおかしくなればというようなふうにも考えられるわけで、その辺どういうふうにお考えになっているかを考えたいです。
はい、ありがとうございます。お待たせいたしました。そして、
ラストクエスチョン。だいぶ前のフォーレンアフェアーズにですね、アメリカのフランシス・フクヤマとハンティントンとミアシャイマー、この3方の考え方が多かれ少なかれ、国際政治を論ずる人に影響を与えていると、こういうコメントを読んだことがありまして、フランシス・フクヤマはもうあまり信用できないと。でハンティントンさんはやっぱり立派だなとは思うんですが、今や日本で最も影響力を行使していただきたいのはこのミアシャイマーさんだなとつくづく感じました。で今日若い方がたくさんいらっしゃるのを心強く思ったんですが、日本人はですね、長い間夢を見ていたと、平和主義の夢を見ていた。ここでやっぱり中国の台頭に対して本当に真剣に、リアリスティックに対応しなきゃいけないと。で核兵器にまで言及された。これは日本ではもうタブーになってる。でアメリカの方々も日本に核武装は絶対許さないという人が非常に多いと。こういう問題について日本がリアリスティックな防衛政策をこれから築いていくためには、やはりアメリカの知識階級の日本に対する認識っていうのを随分改めていただかないとダメじゃないかと。安倍さんを口を極めて非難するニューヨークタイムズをはじめですね、そういうことがやはり日本人を慎重にさせると。 対米的なそのパブリックディプロマシーをどうしたらいいかっていうのは一つの大きな課題だと思うんですが、
はい、
先生のアドバイスをお願いします。
はい、ありがとうございました。それでは、3つまとめて、お答えを、4つですね、失礼しました、お答えいただきたいと思います。中国とそれからモンロー主義について、それからオフェンシブリアリズムの立場からアジアにおける多国間体制の可能性はあるか、それから大国覇権を追求することと、米国その他との経済関係について、そして最後に米国知識層の対日認識、パブリックディプロマシーについて、まとめてコメントいただきたいと思います。そして最後に土山先生からもコメントいただきたいと思います。
Okay, I will answer the 4 questions in the order that they were asked. And the first question actually had 2 parts to it. The first part of the first question had to do with the fact that Japan, the questioner said, has been an anomaly regarding realist theory. In other words, most scholars and policymakers in Japan have not been realists. They've been very liberal in the Western sense of that term. I think that's basically true. The 2 countries that I have the most difficulty with in terms of speaking the same language over the past 35 or so years are Germany and Japan. And it's no accident that both of those countries were thoroughly defeated in World War II, very worried about becoming militaristic again, and therefore tend to reject realist logic. And as the questioner said, and this is true, even during the Cold War, it was very difficult to find Japanese scholars or Japanese policymakers who would use a realist lexicon when you talk to them, which is very interesting. Now, what's changing all of this is not the fact that Prime Minister Abe has come to power. It's the fact that China is rising, and you have had a handful of crises over the Senkaku Islands, and you anticipate big trouble down the road. There's nothing like a good crisis with a big country to focus the mind and get you thinking in realpolitik terms. And that's what's happening here. It's no accident that this is my first visit to Japan. People were really not too interested in what I had to say 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. And I'm not being critical here, by the way. I'm not being critical at all. I think the Japanese behaved very smartly in the past. They rode on the coattails of the United States. It was a smart strategy. I'm not being critical. But as the questioner said, realpolitik was not a language that the Japanese spoke, unlike the Chinese. Okay. And he also said, what happens when the Chinese declare a Monroe Doctrine? Are we pretty much finished? I think the Chinese have made it somewhat clear that they already have a Monroe Doctrine. And as time goes by, it'll become clearer that they want to get the United States out of Asia. And as I said to you, that's a smart strategy from their point of view. But what's going to happen here is we're not going to go without a fight. As I said, the United States, despite its foolish behavior recently, has a rich history of going to great lengths to prevent the rise of peer competitors. So we'll do everything we can to stay, and hopefully we'll work closely with the Japanese and other countries in East Asia and other places around the Chinese perimeter to do what we can to contain the Chinese. I will say, though, and I can't get into this in any detail, it is possible, given the size of the Chinese population, that if it becomes a giant Hong Kong or a giant Taiwan, it will be so powerful that it will just simply dominate Asia. And there'll be nothing that the United States or Japan can do about it. Again, this is why I said at the conclusion of my talk that I hope that China would not continue to rise. With regard to the second question, this was the question about what the balancing coalition looks like. If I'm right, that a balancing coalition or an alliance will form against China. This is an excellent question Because if you look at the geography of the region, it's really hard to see how you get countries that are spread out all over the map to come together to contain China. Many of you in the audience are too young to remember this, but during the Cold War, the center of the Soviet threat was in the heart of Europe. And the United States, France, Germany, Holland, Britain, and Belgium all had forces located right in the center of Europe. We were, in a sense, shoulder to shoulder against the heart and soul of the Soviet threat. And we put together this alliance called NATO to manage all of those countries in their dealings with the United States, which was the central player. In Asia, you're talking about countries like India and Japan that now have good relations but are far away from each other geographically. Even the Philippines and Japan are far away. Japan and South Korea have very tricky relations for historical reasons. So it's going to be tough to put this balancing coalition together. That's what the questioner was saying. I think he's correct. My argument is that this is why it's essential that the United States be deeply involved in Asia and that it act smartly so that it can put that balancing coalition together. And what disturbs me is, based on what I've seen with regard to the Ukraine crisis, the United States has not been behaving smartly, and it doesn't look for the time being like the United States will be in Asia in a big way. And this will make it hard to put that balancing coalition together. The third question had to do with the fact that economic strength is essential to becoming a superpower. And the United States and China have a great deal of economic interdependence. And as this competition gets going, what happens to that economic relationship? Let me make a couple points about that. First of all, before World War I and before World War II, you had an intense security competition in Europe, but nevertheless, you had a great deal of economic intercourse or economic interdependence. So the story that I'm telling you about this security competition does not, let me underline that word, does not mean that economic intercourse between Japan and China or the United States and China is going to end, and these countries are not going to have any economic dealings with each other. You're going to have a great deal of economic intercourse at the same time you have a security competition, just as you did before World War I and just as you did before World War II. It was only during the Cold War where you had a security competition but hardly any economic intercourse where you saw that particular model, okay? So I'm not arguing that economic intercourse is going to, in effect, dry up or go away. Let me make one final point on this. I think this is something that you all want to think about over the next couple decades. If China continues to rise, and you get a security competition here in Asia, and the United States is a major player, which I think will happen, what happens with Europe? And what happens in terms of European-China relations? Now, as I told you, I think eventually the United States will pivot out of Europe. And as I told you, I think Europe will go from being our number one strategic priority to being our number 3 strategic priority, okay? But the Europeans are not going to be threatened by China. And given the economic incentives that the Europeans are going to face, they're going to trade extensively, in my opinion. The Europeans are going to trade extensively with the Chinese. And I believe they will trade dual-use technologies with China, which will make the United States and its Asian allies, including the Japanese, very angry, right? So I think that economic relations will continue between China and the United States, China and Japan, but I think economic relations between China and Europe will become more important for China and will become worrisome for Japan and the United States. With regard to the fourth question, I appreciate the gentleman's comment that there are three different worldviews that have gotten a lot of attention: Frank Fukuyama's, Sam Huntington's, and mine, and that the gentleman thinks that mine will prove to be correct. From an intellectual point of view, that makes me feel very good, as you can imagine. And I would like to applaud you for your brilliant insights. But on the other hand, I think we should hope that I'm wrong about the rise of China. And there is some possibility I'm wrong. As I've said at a number of places here in Japan where I've spoken, my theory of international politics, which underpins my views on the rise of China, is just a social science theory. And like all social science theories, it's sometimes wrong. There's no such thing as a social science theory that gets it right all the time. And I hate to admit it, but sometimes my theory is proved wrong. Not often, in my opinion, but sometimes. With regard to the rise of China, given that I tell a very bleak story, let's hope that I'm wrong and that you and I have to get together and cry in our beer over the fact that my theory proved wrong. But I would say, given what I've seen so far, there's a lot of evidence, it's not decisive evidence, but there's a lot of evidence that I may be proved right. I think Frank Fukuyama's argument will be shown to be wrong, and I think he has, in effect, admitted that his initial argument that democracy was spreading all over the globe, it was this inexorable force that couldn't be stopped, may be true over the next 100 years, but for the foreseeable future, it doesn't look like that's happening. I was actually just at Cornell University to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Frank's article. Frank is a Cornell alum. He graduated from Cornell in 1974, and I have a PhD from Cornell. And they had a big symposium where Frank was the featured speaker about his famous article. And I think it is a brilliant article in many ways, but I do think it's fundamentally flawed. But in listening to Frank talk about the article, it's quite clear that he recognizes that his argument that democracy was spreading across the globe is a hard argument to sustain given what's happened since 1989 when it was published. And with regard to Sam Huntington's argument, I think that argument is simply wrong because civilizations do not matter very much. I believe nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet, and nationalism cuts against civilizational arguments. And as much as I liked Sam, I knew him very well and I had great respect for him, I always thought that the argument was dead wrong. So I think of the three perspectives, mine is the closest to reality, but I do hope I'm wrong. Your final point about nuclear weapons and how thinking in Japan might develop with regard to nuclear weapons, my basic view on this is that it has made eminently good sense up to the present for Japan not to acquire nuclear weapons. Right? I think Japan has played this one very smartly, and I understand why the public is opposed to Japan going nuclear, and many leaders, policymakers and leaders are. Right? But my argument is, as you would expect from a structural realist, my argument is that when the structure or the threat environment that you operate in changes, your incentive structure changes. And the point that I would make is that as this neighborhood becomes more dangerous for Japan, the Japanese will have very powerful incentives to think about acquiring nuclear weapons. And it won't be because American intellectuals or American policymakers tell them X, Y, or Z. It's because the Japanese are collectively very smart, and they will figure out that there is a strong case for acquiring nuclear weapons. There's also a strong case for not acquiring nuclear weapons. But it'll be the structure of the threat environment, it'll be the world that Japan operates in, that in my opinion will dictate what they do.
どうもありがとうございました。はい、最後土山先生、コメントいただけますでしょうか。
はい、 宮島先生の雄弁な話を聞いた後で、私はあんまりコメントする気もしないんですけれども、3つほど申します。日本のリアリズムですけれども、日本にリアリズムがないと言われると、そうでもない。日本の外交は例えば幕末から日清日露一次大戦ぐらいまでですね、幕末のこの佐久間象山なり横井湘南コナンなりですねから始まって、陸奥さん小村さん等々の日清日露日英同盟、日露協商、この動かし方はリアリズムなんです。で、よく彼らはヨーロッパのこのいろんな力関係を見てですね、ああいう関係を日英同盟と日露協商と動かして、最後の方では日露同盟に動かしていくわけですけど、不幸にしてロシア革命があったり、一次大戦があったり、日英同盟が崩れていったりしまして、パワーを失います、パワーベースを失いますけど、日本の外交はリアリズムなんです。戦後の外交だって、51年の日米同盟、60年の海底、69年の若君がやった沖縄返還、佐藤さんがやった沖縄返還、これはリアリズムです。ですので、その表で論理がこの議論されるところと、実際に動かされているところとでは、ギャップがあるわけですね。ですから私どもはこの日本にリアリズムがないと言われるときはそんなことはないんで、リアリズムのない国はこんな国家を築けるはずがありません。ですけども、私が申し上げたいのは、パワーは大事です。パワーは不可欠ですけれども、パワーだけで国際政治を見ることの危険もあるわけで、いろいろなものが関係しますから、ですから日本がこの国がどういう社会をこれから育てて築いていくのかということを、この日本がどういう外交を展開するのかということと関係すると思うんです。2020年には東京オリンピックが参ります。で、私は明日、明後日ですね、スポーツ外交のシンポジウムを青学でここにおられる、小倉和夫先生なんかと協力してやりますけれども、今度の東京オリンピックで日本は何を世界に見せるのか、お見せしたいのか、64年のオリンピックとどう違うのかというようなことはやっぱり非常に大事で、その議論が十分僕は煮詰まっていないんじゃないかと、間に合うのかしらと思いますけれども、スポーツは外交と関係ありませんよと皆さんおっしゃるかもしれませんが、関係があるんです。国を見せるのは外交だけではないんです。いろんな経済活動もいろいろ含めまして、東京財団の活動も含めまして外交です。ですからその中にパワーということは非常に大事なんですけど、パワーだけではないわけで、でもパワーを軽く見る傾向がこの国は、特に学校にはありますので、私先ほど申しましたように青山学院ですから、青山学院で私、土山さんどうして核戦略を教えるんですかと怒られたことがあります。ですけど、私は核戦略が分からない人は戦後の外交分かりませんよって言ってるんですけども、ともかくですね、今日の宮下先生の話は、先ほど申しましたように、これが1回目の日本訪日にならないで2回3回と来ていただきたいと思います。ちょっと1週間早いんですけど、私にとりましては、ちょっとしたクリスマスプレゼントみたいな感じで大変感謝しております。どうもありがとうございました。
どうもありがとうございました。Dr. Mearsheimer, thank you very much. ありがとうございました。